Welcome. In this video, we're going to be continuing to break down Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. It reads, quote, "Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress." Now, we analyzed this first part of the verse in the previous video. It's referring to when Antiochus IV constructed a military outpost known as the Acra near the temple. Now, in this video, we're going to be breaking down the second part of this verse, which reads, quote, "They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate," end quote. Now, this is referring to a monumental event in Jewish history known as the Abomination of Desolation, which occurred in 167 BC. This event is so important that Jesus himself will refer to it in his preaching. So it is really crucial that we understand the history of this event. Now, in order to do so, we first need to understand the layout of the Jerusalem temple. So here it is before us. Now, obviously we have the temple itself. And just before the temple, we have something known as the brazen sea, which the priests use to ceremonially cleanse themselves. And importantly, for our purposes, we have the altar of burnt offering. And this is where priests offer up animal sacrifices. Now, in verse 31, we're told that Antiochus IV is going to abolish the regular burnt offerings. This means that priests are no longer allowed to sacrifice at this altar. The verse then continues saying that Antiochus will set up an abomination that makes desolate. Now, this is referring to some sort of pagan altar which Antiochus places on top of the altar of burnt offering, and upon which unclean animals such as pigs are sacrificed. Therefore, the abomination of desolation refers to this pagan altar on top of the altar of burnt offering, which prevents legitimate sacrifices being made. Now, what sources do we actually have that this occurred? Well, let's begin by breaking down our Jewish sources, which are 1 Maccabees chapter 1, 2 Maccabees chapter 6, and Josephus. So these are our Jewish sources. We also have Diodorus and Tacitus. These are our pagan sources. And we'll also be analyzing Jerome, which is a very late source, but one that we should explore as well. I've also laid out these sources in chronological order, so our Jewish sources are our earliest. Okay, let's begin by analyzing each of these sources, starting with our earliest and therefore most reliable 1 Maccabees chapter 1. It begins with Antiochus IV declaring an order to his entire kingdom. In verse 41 we read, quote, "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land. He forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, which is December 167 BC, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering." End quote. Now, this is referring to the pagan altar on top of the altar of burnt offering upon which pigs are sacrificed. Newsom, commenting on verse 31 of Daniel, writes the following, quote, "The desolating abomination, Daniel 11:31, refers to a pagan altar that was apparently erected on top of the altar of burnt offering, 1 Maccabees chapter 1:54, thus making it impossible to conduct the daily burnt offerings according to the law." End quote. Let's now move on to our next source, which is written a little bit later, which is 2 Maccabees chapter 6. It reads, quote, "Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus." Now let's just pause here for a moment. Notice this added element in this account, and that is that Antiochus renames the Jerusalem temple after the pagan god Zeus. We continue to read, quote, Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and revelling by the Gentiles, who dallied with prostitutes and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath, nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews." End quote. We now come to our final Jewish source, which is Josephus, who writes in Jewish War, Book 1, Chapter 1, quote, "Antiochus compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swines upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death." Josephus then describes this event again in Book 12, Chapter 5, quote, "And when the king had built an altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law, nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day." End quote. We now come to a really interesting pagan source, and that is Diodorus. Now, Diodorus is a Greek historian who wrote between 60 and 30 BC, and as we're reading this quote, it's going to become pretty apparent that Diodorus is pretty anti-Semitic, so just keep that in mind as we're reading it. Okay, let's begin. Quote, "King Antiochus besieged Jerusalem. The Jews withstood the siege for some time, but when all their provisions were used up, they were forced to send ambassadors to him to seek terms for a truce. Many of Antiochus's friends urged him to storm the city and to root out the whole nation of the Jews, for the Jews only of all people hated to mix with any other nations and treated them all as enemies. They suggested to Antiochus that the ancestors of the Jews were driven out of Egypt as impious and hateful to the gods. For seeing that their bodies were infected with white marks and leprosy, the Egyptians gathered the Jews all together and expelled them out of their country as profane and wicked wretches. After they were thus expelled, they settled around Jerusalem and were afterwards united into one nation called the nation of the Jews. But their hatred of all other men descended with their blood to their posterity, and therefore they made strange laws, and quite different from other people. They never will eat nor drink with any other nation or wish them any prosperity. Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, after subduing the Jews, entered into the temple of God, into which none was allowed to enter by their law except the priest. Antiochus found in there the image of a man with a long beard, carved in stone, sitting upon an ass. He took it to be Moses, who built Jerusalem and brought the nation together, and who established by law all their wicked customs and practices, abounding in hatred and enmity to all other men. Okay, we need to stop here for a moment. This is obviously not true. There was no statue of Moses sitting on a donkey in the Jerusalem temple. This is obviously some sort of ancient, false, anti-Semitic polemic that was floating about the ancient world. I think we can say pretty confidently that there wasn't a big statue of Moses sitting on a donkey in the Jerusalem temple. That's kind of ludicrous. Okay, let's keep on reading what Diodorus has to say. He continues, quote, "Antiochus, therefore, abhorring their antagonism to all other people, tried his utmost to abolish their laws. To that end, he sacrificed a great swine at the image of Moses and at the altar of God that stood in the outward court, and sprinkled them with the blood of the sacrifice. He commanded likewise that the books by which they were taught to hate all other nations should be sprinkled with the broth made of the swine's flesh." End quote. So a very interesting source there, which really shows us the anti-Semitism of the ancient world, but also verifies for us the abomination of desolation. But of course, you do need to ignore certain parts which are plainly not true. We now move on to our next pagan source, Tacitus, which is really quite short. It simply reads, quote, "King Antiochus endeavored to abolish Jewish superstition and to introduce Greek civilization. The war with the Parthians, however, prevented his improving this basest of peoples, for it was exactly at that time that Archas had revolted." End quote. So obviously we're not given a lot of detail here. Nevertheless, it's another source confirming that Antiochus did disrupt the Jewish practice at the time. Also take note of this anti-Semitism, which seems to be everywhere in the ancient world. Here Tacitus is referring to the Jews as the basest of peoples. Okay, let's now continue on to our final source, and that is Jerome. Now, Jerome is very late. Jerome writes a commentary of Daniel in 400 AD, so you might be asking yourself, why on earth are we even considering him a source at all? But the reason why I want to discuss Jerome is because he presents an alternative explanation of what the Abomination of Desolation was, and one that you still hear to this day. So Jerome writes in his commentary on Daniel, quote, Antiochus, 2 years after he had plundered the temple in order to exact tribute from the Jews and also to eliminate the worship of God, setting up an image of Jupiter Olympus in the temple at Jerusalem, and also statues of Antiochus himself. These are described as the Abomination of Desolation, having been set up when the burnt offering and continual sacrifice were taken away. End quote. So take note of what Jerome is saying here. Jerome is telling us that the Abomination of Desolation are these statues of Zeus and himself which he erects in the temple. This is opposed to what we've read in our earlier sources, which told us that the Abomination of Desolation was in fact this pagan altar placed upon the altar of burnt offering, upon which pigs are sacrificed. Now, since Jerome is such a late source, we can say with confidence that yes, the pagan altar was in fact the Abomination of Desolation, as our earlier sources tell us. But then we're left wondering, where did this idea come from? Well, Miller, in his book about this, writes the following, quote, all that we can be certain of is that the temple was dedicated to Zeus Olympus, the favored god of Antiochus, and that sacrifices of pigs were carried out on a pagan altar constructed over the altar of burnt offering. He continues, quote, later writers thus clearly assumed that the attribution of the temple of Zeus will have involved a cult statue. In conclusion, however, it has to be admitted that we do not know whether there was a cult statue or more than one in the temple, end quote. So what Miller is saying here is that because we know that Antiochus dedicates the temple to Zeus, as our 2 Maccabees chapter 6 source told us, there obviously was an idea floating around that this meant that statues of Zeus must have been erected, but we simply aren't told that in our earliest sources, so there's therefore no reason to think that. Rather, what we know based upon our earliest sources is that the Abomination of Desolation referred to a pagan altar placed on top of the altar of burnt sacrifices upon which pigs are sacrificed. And that is where we're going to end this video. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, your support would be greatly appreciated. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Just $1 a month makes a huge difference to me, and you really support the channel. But if you're not in a position to give, please consider hitting the like button, leaving some comments, and subscribing. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.